Cool.
Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy, and today it's a wonderful day. I'm joined by Angi Yoder Maina from Kenya. Thanks for joining me, Angi.
Thanks, Jane, for having me on today.
How are you today?
It's a lovely day here. It's a nice, quiet day in my garden, so I'm doing
Okay.
well.
Okay, and so Angi, you work with the Green String Network, and on Twitter, which is how I came across you, there's a beautiful description that you have on your Twitter handle about you being a healing-centered peace-building practitioner. So before we start talking about healing and peace-building and Kenya and trauma and all those kind of things, maybe you can just tell me a bit about yourself and your background, please.
Cool. Thanks again. I'm a Kenyan American. I'm now an immigrant to Kenya. I'm a mother to two amazing girls, a wife of a Kenyan dairy farmer who I met in Kosovo, who was serving with the UN in the early 2000s.
Wow.
We've been back in Kenya since 2005, so I've lived here for 15 years. I grew up in the US on a small farm with horses in rural Iowa. I have been studying peace building from undergraduate now to my dissertation. And for the last 25 years, I've identified as a peace building practitioner. I've lived most of my life in working zones in really violent environments where it's the norm. Poverty is often a given, and exclusion and marginalization go hand in hand. And in those places, you find trauma. Mm-hmm. And you can't actually be a peace builder, I think, that if you don't actually start to deal with the issues of trauma. And that's what I started to realize early on. When I listened to stories in the Balkans, those stories, and maybe you've heard them since there's so many folks from the Balkans who now live in the UK, sometimes they'll tell you stories and it sounds like it's just happened yesterday. And actually those stories are from their grandmothers and their grandfathers. Right. They happened decades before them. They didn't live them. And yet these stories are so alive. And this is because they're so embodied in who they are, their identity. And this has been the same in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Somalia, South Sudan, and Kenya, where I've worked and lived for the last 25 years, I guess. So the last 12 years, though, I've been primarily working with African peace builders, psychologists, police officers, social workers are a part of it, artists, even researchers, to develop and design these social healing processes. And that's what we're calling today this healing-centered approach. I've read Dr. Sandy Bloom, where she talks about how we live in this trauma-organized society. And then when Christine Bethel in the collective trauma collective that was held last year in October, when she said, we need these trauma-informed approaches in order to transform our world to become healing-centered. That's where we actually got the idea of, we don't want to talk just about the negative and the deficit of trauma. We have a vision, and our vision is healing-centered. And that's our goal that we have here at Green String Network, that we call GSN, because everybody has a hard time saying string in East Africa. Everyone has a hard time saying string here because of the R.
Okay. And so then what is the purpose of Green String Network, or GSN? As you said, it is to create this healing-centered approach that is not only looking at the individual, I suppose, but the wider collective and the distress of the individual within the group and the wider society. Is that correct, Angi?
That's totally correct. It's to address trauma as one of the root causes of violent behavior.
Okay.
And it's really important because in many times we think of trauma as a consequence of violence, but actually we understand trauma as a driver of instability and further violence. So it's like the chicken and the egg.
Okay. And so the network is based in Kenya. and you have a number of interesting practices. I know you prioritize storytelling as one of the types of healing approaches. Why is that important, do you think, Angi?
I think it's partially because storytelling is so much a part of global culture. It's a part of every culture, but in Africa, storytelling, fables, it's actually how people learn. And so we started originally putting our methodology together in Somalia with women who were 90, I don't know, probably like 90% illiterate. It was rural women. And all of a sudden we realized we needed images that actually said what would normally come on writing. Mm-hmm. And once we started to get the images, we started to realize, well, the images already tell us if we ask people to tell the story they see, they will already be able to be the experts from lived experience about what it is we're talking about. And so even if we're dealing with complex things that are like developmental trauma, when they see the images of the pictures and they tell the story, they already know what it is because they've already lived that experience. Mm-hmm. And so the storytelling enhances lived experience. Everybody is an expert in their own life and their own story. And thus they are the owners of the healing process. And you don't need outsiders to do the healing. It comes from within you and within your community.
Okay, very interesting indeed. And when you mention the people who have, you know, real feelings as though they've lived through something that they actually haven't, that it is someone else's story as well, but it is their own too, in terms of, I suppose, historical trauma or racial trauma, that if we can't heal the wounds from generations ago, they live within us, whether it's epigenetically or in terms of how safe we feel in our bodies, maybe around other people, and maybe other tribes, or white people if we're Black, or, you know, straight people if we're LGBT.
Yeah.
You mentioned Sandy Bloom, Dr. Sandy Bloom, who I'm a big fan of myself, and creating Sanctuary and the prevalence of trauma. It's not isolated to one group or one country or one gender. You know, it's not all men who do the violence. It's intergenerational. It's in Ireland we have it, in Kenya you have it. What are some of the types of trauma, though, that are kind of common in Kenya and in Africa more generally, Angi?
So yes, I totally appreciate what she said and how she's dealing with this organizationally. As peace builders, we look at something we call the cycle of violence, of how you can hurt yourself. And in this cycle of victimhood, you start to justify being able to hurt others. And we look at how do we break that. And the trauma-informed practice really fits over that, to be able to be both strength-based and breaking, but also how do we hurt ourselves and how do we hurt others. And this idea of chronic violence being more of a dualistic approach of not being kind of, and I don't like the black and white, but I use kind of the red and the blue, and there's many shades of green in there. Mm-hmm. And those many shades of green are the complexity that violence actually is. And so, you know, we have, you know, negative impacts from colonialism here in Kenya and most of Africa still today, even if they're not blatant and in our face, the underlying tension is constantly there. There's an internal oppression that impacts people's self-esteem and a total lack of agency. Many of my husband's age mates were extremely bullied in their schooling. And today when I have conversations with Kenyans to say, look, this isn't right. This isn't how education should be happening. They can see it, but they can't actually stand up for it. They have no agency. So deeply rooted colonial legacies now with the neo-colonial political elites that took over from the colonial powers. And so now we have many class issues and structural issues, systemic poverty, cultural violence, gender inequality, huge issues around sexual violence towards children and women, but also towards men that is unspoken. Child abuse. And I think what COVID-19 has actually done is it's starting to open up to have everyone see what already has been existing divisions among classes. And it's really creating this new sense of vulnerabilities in society. There's this layered, and this is all layered with a general lack of trust in government.
Sure.
Like complete lack. We've had a whole Facebook interaction this last week where young men particularly are coming online and saying COVID-19 is a hoax, it doesn't exist. They're just trying to, you know, stomp on us one more time.
Right. Yeah. And of course, that's not all that surprising if you think about the poor governments that have been in place, maybe, and the brutality of the past, and the keeping people down. It's not surprising that some people would believe that this is just more of the same. In terms of, you referred to developmental trauma there as well, Angi, a bit earlier on. And so if you kind of add up some of those stressors, those traumas in people's lives, again, it's unsurprising if there would be attachment problems, or, you know, if babies are conceived during, you know, as a product of rape, and people are very poor and highly stressed. Then attuned caregiving to a new baby is going to be very challenging, and all of that. Is there widespread understanding in Kenya about the kind of importance of these issues? There's not in Ireland, I don't think. I'm just wondering. People maybe instinctively know attunement's important, but does the state prioritize, you know, information around these issues?
No, and maybe only in the last 2 years, as we at Green String have really been out there putting this out there, has ACEs or developmental trauma actually even been something that kind of, what I'd say is that the mental health field is actually even starting to talk to. But what I know is when I have these conversations with particularly young people, they immediately click, they immediately say, this is something that I have been through. And they immediately start to understand it's not a life sentence. I can actually start to deal with this now that I understand it. But it's not really, we don't have trauma-informed education anywhere. I'd say that there's one home run by an American woman who has a children's home that I would say is very trauma-informed that I know of. And other than that, it's really lacking information. And so in Ireland, you're actually yards ahead of us.
Okay. Well, that's good to know, I guess. But on the other hand, I suppose there are some inherently healing practices in Africa. I mean, from the reading that I've done, you know, the importance of the group, the fact that it's maybe not as atomized, individualistic society where you're kind of on your own. It's super fast paced. But then, of course, this warfare and genocide in certain parts of Africa that take a unspeakable toll on the whole population. But I find it very interesting that young people find this useful information to get, that they can kind of go, I am not broken. Some of my challenges are normal. These things have an impact, but it's also not a sort of death sentence. It's not, I can't do anything differently. There is healing to be had. I can reach out to others. my stress response system has been out of whack, but whose wouldn't be, kind of thing. And is it then a little bit freeing for them?
Incredibly freeing for them. I meet a lot of young people on Twitter. One of my younger staff members made me go on Twitter like 2 years ago. And in that time, I have now met so many, they'll call me right on Twitter and say, can we just have a coffee? And without a doubt, the conversation within the first 10 to 15 minutes, and many of them are mental health influencers or people talking about mental health, but they haven't found the answers they're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And when they do start to find, you know, they're searching, they're really searching. And so they're looking, they're having a coffee with a lot of different people. And so within 5-10 minutes, we're on ACEs, and we spend the rest of the conversation about adverse childhood experiences, the brain, how it works, how our nervous system ties it all together. And they look at me and they're like, but this information has been there, why don't we have it?
Yeah.
And they go out and start researching, and they start advocating, and they start talking about it, and they own it. You know, I've just seen several young people begin to flourish with just a tiny bit of a coffee information that they go back out and do many other things with.
Yes, that's been my own experience as well, you know, in Ireland, and for older people too, you know, people who might be 40 and have a rake of addictions and relational problems and mental health issues. And then they get this information. It's like, okay, this is why I am not unusual. I am not the problem. These circumstances were more than I could bear, but there is hope and healing.
Yes, exactly.
And that is so important, isn't it, Angie, that we, in how we give the information to people, it must be packaged in a way that doesn't seem like there is no hope in sight, that this is it, you know, and that's the whole healing part, I guess. So can you tell me a little bit about how do people heal in your experience?
So some of the best ways that we did at one point, okay, so I have an intercultural marriage, and I really wanted, can I do one thing? Can we just stop so I get the dogs to stop it?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I'll press pause. We're back. So Angie,
yeah.
how from your experience, you know, how do people heal? Obviously, it's an individual thing. One thing won't work for everyone, but in general, what have you found to be useful and helpful for people?
So I'm in an intercultural marriage for almost 20 years. And at one point when we settled back in Kenya, we had tensions with cultural issues. And I told my husband, I really want to see a marriage therapist. I think it would help us. And he looked at me and he's like, we don't do that. We just don't do that. That's not in our culture. No.
Okay.
And yet he was also struggling with issues. And so it ended up that in the end, we went to the grandmother across the street and had a cup of tea for an hour every week for about 3 months. And we sorted out our issues. And I started to realize that, first of all, this organized kind of more mental health counseling approach really doesn't tap into what people feel, because they feel like if you have to go to this kind of an expert, something's wrong with you.
Right.
Instead of this idea of something's happened to you. So we actually, I started to realize, well, it's probably more peer support that we need. And, you know, the idea around trauma, the trauma healing work that I was already starting to do, I'd had a mentor to me who said, you know, it doesn't matter if they know how the brain works and if everything gets together, but if you're really sitting people down in a circle, 12 to 15 people once a week for 2 hours for 3 to 6 months, she said that will change people's lives just because of the collective nature, and they will start to redevelop connection within their own communities that will help them when things get tough, because toughness always comes back.
Sure.
And so with those two ideas, we started to really develop peer support, looking at circle processes. We started to do the more complicated kind of complex issues on very simple drawings and artwork. I know that there have been people from Western Europe and others who've looked at some of our artwork and they're like, oh my God, they're too violent. You're going to re-traumatize people. And yet when I ask people who are using it, they say, no, you've reflected our true experience. And this is what we have to deal with. And we're not, you know, there's too many things that re-traumatize us every single day. This isn't re-traumatizing us. This is a reflection of our true experience. And so it's been that collective piece of using the artwork, the circle processes, the collective, and then people start to own it and they bring in the drumming, they bring in the dancing, they bring in every kind of medium you think could come in, comes in. There might be meditation. We help them with deep breathing. We're starting to do some more things around balancing the nervous system and tapping on different sides and things like that. And we give a little tiny piece of information, and the next thing they'll do is they'll come back to their session that's led by their colleagues, like their peers in the community, and they'll be like, oh yeah, and my grandmother told me we used to sing this song and we did this tapping back and forth. So they're finding that some of the newer stuff we bring in, when they go back and look at it culturally, there's always something that meshes with it. And so it's been a really good learning experience. There's nothing that says it has to look exactly like this. Every group is different. But the collective process of creating safety in a group, recreating group identity, and then just that relationship, it's building a new resilience really at the most grassroots area, which when I explain what is happening here, people are like, in Western Europe and the US are like, but that's what we need. We lack community. We lack the ability to work with each other and feel connected. So it's something that is very African, but I think it's actually something that's very human.
You're right. Yeah, absolutely. It's very needed. We all need it. You know, we need to have healthy relationships. We need to feel we belong. We need to feel safe around other people, you know, and rebuild trust if we've lost it. I mean, what I find so interesting from the polyvagal theory perspective, which I've come to love, I think it's so fascinating. And the type of activities that Dr. Stephen Porges have said regulate our neural state. Many of them you just mentioned, you know, the drumming, the group activity, the deep breathing, the slow out breaths, the dancing, kind of movement medicine, singing is another one that apparently is really good. So those have been in all of Africa for all time, and indeed they've been across the world for all time. But in our rush to be modern and sophisticated and successful, we've lost a lot of it in many cultures.
And even in Africa, so in the urban setting, in my husband's setting here, where he's grown up in the city, the middle class, the lower class, the city folks have lost it. But they still have grandmothers and grandfathers in the villages where they ask them, was this something that was normal? And they can still hear about it. But, you know, the same way that the rest of the world has modernized, so has Africa.
Of course.
And so a lot of these collective processes have gone with it.
Right.
Which really surprised me because
Oops, I've lost you there. I lost the connection, just broke up a little bit there. It broke up when you were saying that it surprised you that some of the collective processes had been lost with modernization and development.
Would you like me to repeat that?
If you wouldn't mind. Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. So even when I moved back or moved to Africa 20 years ago, I was really shocked and surprised that these collective processes were no longer really a part of what made up Kenyans or made up, my husband's community. And a lot of that, I believe, was lost, particularly from my husband's community because he's Kikuyu, was lost actually in the Mau Mau fight at independence, and a lot of traditions, a lot of collective processes were taken away in many ways because of needing to split the community and have people who spied on others and lots of different things. So the collective nature in the urban setting and in particular communities is really lost.
Mm-hmm. Would any aspect of it either have been, kind of due to racism, or a sense that some of these things were old-fashioned, or not conducive, maybe primitive, I don't know if that's the right word, but not conducive to, as I say, success, outward money making, and kind of the Western value system, maybe, and that then people internalize this themselves and kind of go, if they're young, that's a bit embarrassing, I don't really want to do that, not knowing that they're inherently soothing to the nervous system and important in terms of belonging.
I think you're right. I think people looked at it as old-fashioned and not modern, and there was a whole need to try and be modern very quickly as Africa started to develop, and development became like the key way to do this. My gut feeling is that the boarding schools kind of killed a lot of it, because so many of my husband's generation down to currently today, they stop growing up in the family from as young as 3rd, 4th grade, and they start going to boarding schools.
Wow,
And
I didn't know that.
Yeah, the boarding school system here is been very much entrenched. It's built off of the British boarding school system, and it's I think has had an extreme impact on attachment and family connection.
Sure.
And what COVID-19 has actually done, because all our schools are closed, is kids are actually living at home right now. And maybe for the long foreseeable future, it could actually have a very positive impact in that way, because of reconnecting and the attachment and all of these different things. And then the schools, kids were really bullied. They were really treated very badly, and if they had any of those things they might have brought with them, they would have been seen as not being modern and catching up. So yeah, I think a lot of that is tied into that very influential process that boarding schools has had on the shape of who Kenyans are today.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I had no idea about that at all. Obviously, in the English context, the ruling classes have long gone to boarding school. And it is a form of trauma in itself. Like you say, it's major attachment rupture, relational kind of disintegration a lot of the time. And then having no supportive buffers to help you make sense of the bullying, to kind of hold you and keep you safe and tell you you don't deserve this. And then people shut down and dissociate and kind of pretend it never happened as coping strategies, I guess. Angi, I spoke to an Irish guy, a psychiatrist from Cork called Dr. Pat Bracken, for this series a couple of weeks ago, and he spent some time in Uganda as a young man. He qualified as a psychiatrist, didn't like our institutions in Ireland, didn't like the model of care, and saw a job in Uganda working with torture survivors after the Idi Amin regime collapsed. And he's very much about the ecological sort of context of mental health and mental illness, and how from being in Uganda and other places since, he kind of found that our Western diagnostic model and approach of looking at the individual, treating them and their disorders as kind of not being sufficient and not being appropriate, particularly in other places that have a collective wound. I suppose in your work, again, the peace building, healing centered work, am I right in thinking you would share some of those views that the individual is the individual and they have their symptoms and they have their stress response system and this, that, and the other, but they exist within a group and a society and a wider system that needs to be looked at too. How do you work to heal collective wounds?
I can't say yes any louder than yes. You know, like we keep having this conversation. I think COVID-19 is highlighting what global collective trauma might look like, where climate change was taking us down that path, but we had so many similar experiences. This is really collective distress. And we're going to have to move from what I think is a failed individual disorder model and start to look at what's this narrative of shared distress. And we need that human connection and mutual support. And so for us, it's creating peer support. It's creating new, strong relationships, getting people to own their own healing. And with that, they start to become agents of transformation and change within their community, and they tap into all those, you know, community adverse environment issues that are also impacting even the adversity that their children or they faced. And so, you know, we are now having to learn to reconnect. And I just think it's around attachment, it's around connection. And that's why this body of work, what we're doing, we see so strongly how this is going to be something that actually helps us take this work further forward in Kenya when we come out of some form of self-isolation and working at home. Because right now, the whole of Kenya is looking at their collective distress and saying, what do we do with it?
Mm-hmm. Right, okay. So the moment will be ripe in the sense that people will be maybe more prepared to look at the needs of the group going forward, because we've all been in it together to a degree and we all need to exit it together somehow.
Somehow. Yeah, and the connection that means even south to north, you
Right.
know, I think that also is a real opportunity to have conversations that up until now really couldn't even be broached.
And so, Angie, in terms of policy, which is the overarching theme of this special series of Law and Justice, do you guys as a network engage with policymakers in Kenya at all?
A lot.
Okay.
We've been working with the National Police Service on creating a national trauma-informed policing initiative.
Amazing.
Early March, just before we kind of all moved into lockdown, the Inspector General launched this national program called Mamko Mpya, which is kind of Great Awakenings or New Awakenings, Healing the Uniform, into a national program, because they've realized as the police, as they reform, because there's a huge reform agenda on the police, that they have high suicide rates, high homicide rates, high brutality issues, and that there's a lot of issues within the service that translates to the public. And we've had the amazing opportunity over the last year to work with the police to create what I think is actually a really cutting edge initiative globally within the Kenyan police. And when I explain this to anyone, they're like, really? The Kenyan police were open to that? But there was a moment of time, because of the reform agenda and because of the exposure of the senior level of the police, who have said, if we don't help our officers, if we don't help their families, and if we don't start to change, we won't be an institution in the future, kind of thing. Like, we will become something that can no longer function. So they were very open to that. We've also worked with the prisons to a small degree, particularly with prison wardens.
Okay.
And I'd love trying to open up, how do we actually start to work with young people in prisons so that they're coming out? Because if you look at the prisoners in most of our prisons, you have high adverse childhood, high developmental trauma. You have high levels of, being impacted by the pair of ACEs of Dr. Wendy Ellis. These things are left undealt with, and they come back into the community. They don't reintegrate, and they become more hardened criminals. And so we're really interested in also starting to look at how do we work with the education sector and the justice sector, as we're already doing work with police and kind of community and county government, so different levels of government. But there's a lot of interest in this. We've made it very Kenyan. When people look at the images, everybody says, oh, I can see myself. So I think we're coming over a hurdle. Yes, it's super important. People see themselves, police officers see themselves, because everyone said police won't tell you their worst stories. We have heard the worst stories you can hear about police from the police themselves,
right?
Because they said we have to change. And when that's owned and when that agenda is theirs, there's nothing to stop it, because it takes on a life of its own. And right now, right before this, the National Training Institution was talking to us about how to create a program that would have people coming with civilians from the station level, and creating a civilian police program that would go back and lead these healing forums within stations and within the community. And that's remarkable.
Yeah, well done.
If you told me a year ago this is where we'd be, I'd have told you no, never, maybe in 10 years. But it moved very quickly because of the ownership.
And that's so important. Everything has to be collaborative and kind of listening, again, in terms of the polyvagal informed activities, just listening to people's stories and their gripes as police. That is healing and co-regulating for them, because if they're products of this wider trauma organized society and have their own traumas and are doing traumas onto others, that lodges in their bodies and their brains and their nervous systems too. And so it's kind of a win-win if you can get people to see that this isn't going to destroy your job or take away the good bits of your job. It's for our mutual benefit. We'll have a safer society if we can make a few adjustments. So that's tremendous. And have you done any bits of work in the more prevention focus with early years and kind of maternity supports or preschools and that type of thing, Angie?
We've not been able to tap into that. We're 3 years old as an organization.
Okay, wow, you've achieved a lot in 3 years already.
Exactly. I have a couple of folks on my team who are very interested in the early childhood issues, and also in issues around schooling. So we could go in 1,000 different directions. Sure. But yeah, we'd be very, very interested in that. But that's not been where we've taken most of our focus, unfortunately, because there's just too little resources for and not enough time in the day.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I get you entirely. In terms of public policy, post COVID-19, whenever that might be, what would you like to see change most? One or two things that you think could make a major difference?
So in Kenya, if I were dreaming dreams and dreams could come true, it would be more social justice, more social support for the poor, including, improvements in basic water supply, sanitation, housing, healthcare. COVID has shown us that if you live in a community that gets water once a month, it's really hard to wash your hands constantly all day, every day. I'd also like to see Kenya return to what I'd call a true quality public education, where every child could access quality education and use that trauma-informed lens, because it's really shown that rich schools can keep going, rich parents can keep paying, although they're also not being able to pay because their incomes are now being shattered. So those are the two things for Kenya. And I guess policy-wise globally, it goes back to that idea of creating a new narrative of shared distress and replacing, kind of individual disorders, which I think is a failed one. And I tell everyone here, and they're always surprised, that I don't understand why as Kenyans we're actually copying the West so much in this way, because it's actually a failed system in the West. Yeah. And when I say that, people look at me and they're like, really? Nobody's ever said that to us so clearly. And I think that's going to come out in this global pandemic.
How has the actual state responded to COVID-19 in the country? Have there been very clear instructions? Obviously, you're in a lockdown as well. You mentioned the water and hand washing, and my goodness, that's pretty stark. When you don't have clean water or any water, how are you meant to practice superb hygiene? What about income supports or making sure that basic needs are met? Because Maslow's whole thing about progressing up the pyramid, love, belonging, as self-actualization, frankly, none of us can really accomplish all that much at the moment that way. We're all kind of surviving. But if you can't even really survive because you've no food, you've no money, has the Kenyan state kind of, put things measures in place to protect the most vulnerable?
No.
Okay.
It's been a lot of wish to do that. Primarily it's being done by the private sector and by citizens who are stepping up and trying to take care of our brothers and sisters who are really in a crisis. They're really, it's scary. Nairobi has been locked down as a city, as a town, as a greater Nairobi area, I think for the last 5 weeks. There are 2 neighborhoods in Mombasa and Nairobi that have been also even more greatly locked down. We've had a curfew from 7 p.m. to 5 p.m. For at least 5 weeks plus, or maybe 6 weeks. People in the informal settlements don't have work. They're not getting income into their families. Hunger has started to really set in. And at the same time, we've securitized our response. So to keep people in their houses by 7 p.m., we've beaten people up. If they're not wearing masks, they're being beaten up. So the securitization has happened. It's just horrible, but in an informal settlement here in Nairobi, about 500 homes were destroyed by the government, and a court had said that couldn't happen, and those homes were still destroyed, and we're having annual long rains. We have COVID, we have a curfew. Where were the poorest of the poor supposed to go when you destroyed their little tiny shack? It just doesn't make any sense. And so on top of that, we actually have like a locust infestation in the country. So it's eating all of our food. We have floods that are coming because of the long rains. Our part of Nairobi has actually been cut off from our water source because floods have destroyed the dam. So there's like all these like layers of issues that go on top of the fact that there is no kind of government support or government social support or social support network. And it's getting dire. Will people be able to continue to stay at home? How much longer? Friday is supposed to be when the Nairobi blockade is actually supposed to be lifted, if it's going to be lifted, and yet our caseload is rising now. We've had a very low caseload for the first 2 months, and now we're at a point where community transmission is actually starting in the informal settlements. And we have a lot of people who are very scared, don't know what to do, and all of our schools are closed. And the last time I listened to the minister, he said they could be closed for another year. We don't know, nobody knows. And I don't want to be down on the Kenyan government, because I think the Kenyan government versus someplace like Tanzania has really tried, and they don't know what they're doing. Nobody knows exactly what we're supposed to do. And they don't necessarily have all the resources to be able to do this in a way that would make the most sense. So it's complex, it's hard, it's not easy, and everybody's kind of freaked out.
And that's across the world as well. I mean, there have been very patchy responses. The US, for example, and the UK have taken certain types of approaches and are going to unlock the economy sooner than might be prudent. But you do paint a fairly grim picture there in terms of the accumulation of kind of natural disaster type aspects on top of the COVID, on top of adverse childhood experiences and community environments. It's certainly a bit of a scary prospect, and I'm sure there are aspects of that elsewhere in Africa as well, as there are. I was talking to Wendy Ellis yesterday, and while it's different, she wasn't talking about settlements that being knocked down. The most poor and vulnerable and underprivileged and marginalized are the ones most at risk and exposed by the lack of kind of a holding system. And of course, in some countries, there are only limited resources anyway. There isn't an unending supply of funds to make available.
I mean, in Africa, like Liberia, they have 4 ventilators.
Wow.
There, South Sudan, 4. The couple in Somalia. I mean, there are places that actually, if this really takes off and is something that, as we see happening in the UK and the US or in Italy or China, it will overrun a very already overrun healthcare system. Well, so the reason the government has been so strong about the lockdown is there are policy members who know that and who are trying to mitigate that.
Yeah. And that's right there, that's good leadership. They did what they could do, rather than saying, let's keep it open, let's keep the economy going as long as we can. When that's all they could do, at least they did it, and here's hoping you won't have a major manifestation. To go to Ireland now slightly, but it is related to that point about COVID, about genocide, kind of the traumas that can happen on the continent of Africa that then might move to other countries in the sense of migration or the asylum process. Right now, airports are closed, no one can really travel, but in the past and in the future, people will again. And in Ireland, we have had a small number of asylum seekers from Africa. Some people would say that we have an institutionally racist system where there's an inbuilt belief that we don't get legitimate asylum seekers, that people are kind of making it up, and they're just trying to get in to get our nice benefits, and this type of sinister kind of economic migrants as opposed to fleeing hardship and oppression and atrocities. And then there's also a problem within the legal system of not understanding trauma at all, not understanding memory, and demanding clear, coherent narratives with no holes, no contradictions, not too much emotion, but enough to be believable, so much so that a survivor kind of is up against it in terms of being believed. What, Angi, do you think any decent human rights respecting asylum system anywhere needs to know about safety, trauma, and memory?
So my really simple answer to a really complex question is, look for compassion and create systems and structures around how to deal with asylum seekers and migrants just around compassion. Whether it's a war refugee, asylum seeker, or an economic migrant from Africa, they've experienced things that you will never even imagine in even just getting to Ireland. The path to Europe is long and hard. It's not an easy place to reach. And economic migrants have left home because they feel they have no choice. And it isn't because, and it's because of all those issues that I actually highlighted earlier in our session, in our talk, because they're not making a fully rational and good decision to decide to go.
Mm-hmm.
And when they do go, they encounter, horrors. I've done interviews with folks who've made it and folks who actually didn't make it and got stuck in places for years. And, it was sexual violence and rape of women and men. It was, being held hostage until the people who were supposed to help them could get additional money from their family. So basically kidnapping them and demanding, if you cared for your loved one, you would send additional money to get them across to Europe. It's hunger, all of those different things on just the journey. The route's so dangerous, it's violent. Many never make it. But those who do are truly real survivors. And what we know with survivors is we carry layers and layers and layers of ways of being different to whoever we're talking to. Mm-hmm. And so we don't ever feel safe if healing hasn't actually come forward. And they're carrying that with them. And so they're meeting the system, they're meeting, the Irish government or wherever they're seeking asylum, they're meeting that with layers of understanding how they got to where they are. And yeah, their memories will be not as good as they should be or what people expect it to be. They will have different answers at different times, who they're talking to. They're just surviving because they're still in that survival zone. And there's not a single one who I know who's left because they were actually here in their rational part of their brain. They were all in the fight, flight, flee mode. Yeah. They were off to go. And so the only way you can meet somebody who still lives in that, their nervous system has not changed, mm-hmm. is with compassion. Mm-hmm. And that's why the trauma-informed approaches are so important if you're going to move to that healing-centered mm-hmm. place. So a system with compassion is the only way, because you will hear really amazing stories of survival and eventually thriving if you give them a chance, because they've made it through so much. And it isn't because, they've gone there and they've made up a funny story. That generally doesn't happen. Today in Europe, if you've come in the last five years, particularly because of all the new restrictions and all the new safeguards to keep it from happening, the people who have come through a very harrowing situation. And that also goes for those particularly coming to the UK as war refugees from Syria and the Middle East as well.
Yes, and of course then in Ireland people are held in what's called direct provision centres. So they're basically like B&Bs where, children can end up in them for 6, 7, 8 years because the system is slow and they're still in survival mode. Like some babies are born into that system. Where they have parents who are under chronic stress, not knowing, will we be allowed to stay here or will we be sent home, and what will we be sent home to? We've nothing. In other countries in Europe, people are in these big camps where there's huge levels of violence and hardship, and also now are breeding grounds for COVID-19, of course, you know. So these areas where we warehouse people in very close confines are very problematic. Is there any advice just in terms of the legal system itself? Like the law, I found, is based on this very faulty premise that we're essentially rational beings, you know, that we always make rational choices, and we know what we're doing, we think through the consequences, and if we don't, again, we're disordered. Do you think all legal systems could benefit from some understanding about neurobiology and stress and fight, flight, freeze, in order, I suppose, to be more compassionate and have a kind of therapeutic approach to justice?
It is a foundation, whether it's justice, whether it's peace building, whether it's governance in general. This information that you're talking about is actually the game changer that starts to shift. And so if Ireland wants to become the leader in Europe on this, this is where you start to create those systems and you start to show we're doing this because this is actually what we've all done wrong for so long. This is why, as a peace builder, as somebody who's done governance work, this has become my life passion, because it's the missing link, and it's the missing link in justice, in law, in post-conflict programming that, you know, governments give money all over the world to do. But when it gets, and this is a part of the thesis that I'm just finishing, there's a whole group that say, I don't want to hear it, I want to ignore it, It doesn't matter, because we just want to build something hard and, you know, logical and reasonable, and then everybody should get on the same picture. But we know that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in Ireland. It doesn't happen in America. It doesn't happen in Kenya.
Yeah. Well, best of luck with that dissertation, Angi. And you guys are doing remarkable work, you know, and we share so many similar views, although we come from very different areas of work and expertise. It's such an exciting movement, actually, on Twitter and social media, to learn from great people in other parts of the world, and to see really we are all the same despite our differences, you know, that we need the same things. We need to be safe in our bodies and loved and cherished and have healthy relationships and have our basic needs met. We need a social safety net. And that doesn't matter whether it's Kenya or Washington, D.C. or London or anywhere else in the world, for that matter. And I've enjoyed so much talking to you this morning. Thank you very much for your time, Angi, and for talking to me about trauma and peace building and adverse childhood experiences, and a gamut of other things, the benefits of story and art and peer support. I'm a big believer in that myself. You know, lived experience is what has great wisdom. And certainly in Ireland, we're only gradually learning about that, and kind of being willing, I suppose, for the experts, you know, the professionals, to give up a bit of power. I'll just ask you one last question. Do you think that is important, that it is a collaborative thing where all voices are heard, and all perspectives, and that the lived expertise perspective is possibly the most important one, or certainly has to be raised up from the place in the cobwebs that it's often been shoved in the past?
I think 100% that's actually really important. And one of the things we keep telling everybody is you are the expert. So it's not necessarily getting rid of expertise.
There you go, yeah.
It's redefining that everybody brings a different type of expertise, and that they're all really critically important. And so, you know, lived experience is extremely valuable in the in the healing process. In fact, it should take the lead, and then some of the other pieces fill in the gaps, help make things actually better than, even if I don't know about this, but I have a sense of it, I can get other kinds of help that help support me in my healing process. So it's definitely one of the things that we know and believe in. For example, in Kenya, we have, you know, thousands of young kind of psychology graduates right now who really can't find a job because they have a level of expertise that isn't matched with the community. And creating policies that say everybody should see a psychologist won't help if people can't afford them and they don't believe in them.
Yeah,
so I'm really interested in working with young psychologists to make what they know, to be able to listen to learned experience and become facilitate in people's healing journey, rather than being the ones who say, you should do it like this. Yeah. And so it's a mix, it's a mesh. And I think COVID will help us actually see some of those pieces. And I'm really encouraged in Kenya because I think we're on the verge of really starting to have some new understandings about a lot of things like this.
Okay, that's super. It's lovely to end on a hopeful note, and there is great hope. I think we can only hope, Angie, isn't that right? Because we can only hope and imagine a better future, because the past we're leaving hasn't necessarily been great for enough people. I think, you know, it's been great for the few, but not for the many. Angi Yoder Maina, thank you so much for your time and your insights and your wonderful work. I will look forward to further interactions on Twitter and beyond, and best of luck to you and all your colleagues going forward.
Jane, thank you so much. It was lovely to connect, and again, admire so much about what you're doing in Ireland. And yeah, let's keep connecting. Thank you so much.
This was How to Talk Policy and Influence People with Angi Yoder Maina. Bye-bye, Angie. Take care. Bye.